On the night of February 10, 1990, the city of Las Cruces was winding down. It was a quiet Saturday. Nothing about the evening suggested history was about to be written in blood. Inside a modest neighborhood bowling alley, families were still gathered. Teenagers laughed. Employees cleaned counters. The smell of fried food hung in the air. This was not a place people associated with danger, and yet, before the night was over, it would become the site of one of America's most haunting, unsolved crimes. Just after 8:30 p.m., two men walked through the front doors. They did not rush. They did not shout. They carried firearms. At first it looked like a robbery. What followed was something far darker. The gunmen immediately took control of the room. They ordered everyone to the ground. Employees were forced behind the counter. Customers were herded together. Among them were children. Witnesses would later describe the men as calm, focused, almost methodical. They demanded money from the registers and the office safe. But the robbery was only the beginning. For reasons still unknown, the gunmen began shooting, one by one, execution style. People who had already complied. People who posed no threat. People who begged. 7 individuals were shot at close range. 4 would die from their injuries. 3 survived, gravely wounded, but alive. Those survivors would become the center of everything that followed. The attackers fled with an estimated $4,000 to $5,000 in cash. No alarms stopped them. No security cameras captured their faces clearly. No police arrived in time. Within minutes, the bowling alley was transformed from a family space into a crime scene of unimaginable horror. Emergency responders rushed in. What they found stunned even seasoned professionals. Bodies on the floor. Blood pooled near the lanes. Victims barely clinging to life. Doctors would later say it was a miracle that anyone survived at all. But 3 did. And what they would tell police made the case seem, at first, the survivors provided descriptions. They described 2 Hispanic men, one taller, one shorter, both speaking English. They recalled clothing, voices, builds. Most importantly, they believed they could identify them again. Investigators believed they had a chance. The crime shocked the nation. Media outlets descended on Las Cruces. Headlines called it a massacre, a senseless act of brutality. Public pressure mounted immediately. How could a robbery escalate into mass execution, and why? Police canvassed the area. Roadblocks were set up. Tips flooded in. Within days, names began circulating. Suspects were whispered about in neighborhoods. Former employees, known criminals, associates with histories of violence, but none of it led to arrests. The case began to slow. Then came a breakthrough. Investigators focused on a man named William McCarty. He had a criminal history. He fit parts of the description. He was known to police. Witnesses were shown photo lineups. At least one survivor identified McCarty as one of the shooters. It seemed like progress, but it wouldn't last. McCarty denied involvement. There was no physical evidence tying him to the crime scene. No weapon, no fingerprints, no DNA. And as the investigation dragged on, doubts crept in. Other suspects emerged. Different names, different theories. Some witnesses changed details. Others grew uncertain. The bowling alley massacre was no longer a straightforward case. It was becoming something far more complicated. Months passed, then years. Families buried their dead. Survivors lived with permanent injuries, physical and psychological, and still, no one was charged. Critics began questioning the investigation. Why were leads not followed more aggressively? Why were suspects released? Why did evidence seem to stall? Law enforcement maintained they were doing everything possible, but the truth was uncomfortable. The case was slipping away. By the mid-1990s, it was clear the massacre was going cold. Witness memories faded, suspects died, tips dried up. The bowling alley reopened. Life in Las Cruces moved forward, but the case never truly left, because 3 people had survived, and they never forgot the faces of the men who pulled the triggers. The question wasn't whether the killers existed, it was whether justice would ever find them, and as part 2 will reveal, the answers only became more disturbing. Subscribe Criminal Verse, where every crime hides a story. When a crime goes unsolved for decades, the truth doesn't disappear, it fractures. And in the Las Cruces bowling alley massacre, those fractures became impossible to ignore. As the years passed, investigators quietly admitted something troubling. They believed they knew who was responsible, but belief is not proof. Multiple suspects were investigated over time. Some were linked through informants, others through witness statements. None were ever charged. One of the most damaging issues was evidence handling. Ballistics evidence existed, but technology at the time was limited. DNA testing was either unavailable or inconclusive. Physical evidence was never strong enough to secure indictments. The survivors remained cooperative. They gave interviews. They testified in hearings. They participated in reconstructions. Yet prosecutors hesitated. Why? Because eyewitness testimony, especially after trauma, is fragile. Defense attorneys would have torn it apart, and law enforcement knew it. As years passed, internal reviews raised uncomfortable questions. Why were early leads dismissed? Why weren't suspects surveilled longer? Why did interagency cooperation break down? There were whispers of tunnel vision, that investigators focused too narrowly, too early, that alternative theories were ignored. One theory suggested the massacre wasn't random, that it was personal. Another suggested it was drug-related. Others believed it was simply extreme violence triggered by panic, but no theory could be proven. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, cold case detectives reopened the files. Boxes of evidence were reviewed, witnesses re-interviewed, new forensic methods were applied. Still, nothing. Some suspects had died, others had vanished, memories conflicted, and the bowling alley massacre became a case defined not by what was known, but by what went wrong. Survivors expressed frustration, families expressed anger, public trust eroded. How can a case with survivors identifying the shooters remain unsolved? People asked. There was no satisfying answer. The truth was brutal. Without physical evidence, prosecutors refused to move forward, and without prosecution, law enforcement could not publicly name suspects. The killers, whoever they were, walked free. Today, the case remains officially open. It is still listed as unsolved. Detectives say they will never stop pursuing justice, but time is undefeated. Witnesses age, memories fade, evidence degrades, and yet the case still haunts investigators, because it represents a nightmare scenario. A mass shooting, multiple eyewitnesses, clear suspect descriptions, and still, failure. The Las Cruces bowling alley massacre isn't just about violence, it's about the limits of the justice system. It's about how quickly certainty can dissolve, and how some crimes leave scars not just on families, but on institutions. 3 people survived. They saw the gunmen. They remember that night. And they live knowing the men who did this were never held accountable. That is the legacy of this case. Not just unanswered questions, but unfinished justice. Subscribe Criminal Verse, where every crime hides a story.